want to talk to you about something that I don't think is always obvious when you're inside an organization. When things go wrong, we tend to look for a moment, whether it's a decision or a failure or a point where something clearly shifted. We're looking for something we can point back to and say, that's where it started. But when you actually take a step back and look at how these situations, how they tend to develop, it rarely feels like that at all. There often isn't a clear turning point. It's more like something has been moving very slowly and quietly over time. And because it moves like that, it's very easy to be part of it without really noticing it as it happens. And I think the difficult part is that we tend to think about risk as something that's quite fixed, as if there's a line somewhere between safe and unsafe, and our job is simply to stay on the right side of that. But in reality, that line doesn't stay still, it shifts. And more often than not, it's shifting gradually. Let's imagine we're standing on a shoreline and we're watching the tide come in. We don't really notice the movement moment to moment. If we look away, though, for a few minutes and then look back, it still feels like the same place, but the water's just there. But if you stay long enough, you eventually realize you're standing somewhere completely different to where you started. And not because there was a sudden change, but because of a constant, almost invisible movement that just added up over time. Organizations, well, they can behave in a very similar way. What feels acceptable today isn't always the same as what felt acceptable a year ago. But because the change happens in small steps, it doesn't stand out as it's happening. It just feels like things are continuing as they always have. And what's interesting is that those changes usually begin in ways that, well, they feel entirely reasonable. There's a situation that doesn't quite fit the process. There's something that needs to be delivered or it needs to be resolved. And the usual way of doing things, well, it isn't quite working in that moment. So what do? We adjust. Something is adjusted. There's a slightly different approach taken, maybe a small shortcut, but there's a way that we're going to get through the problem and that's going to keep everything moving. And it works. That's always the important part. Because once it works, it doesn't just solve the problem. That's when it becomes part of the system. And that's when something very subtle happens. Because the next time a similar situation comes along, that adjusted way of working, well, that no longer feels new. Now it feels familiar. And because it feels familiar, well, it doesn't attract the same level of attention. Now, I remember speaking to someone a while ago who described it. They described it in a way that really stuck with me. They said, at no point did it feel like we were doing anything wrong. It just felt like we were getting better at making things work. And I think that's quite revealing because from the inside, that's exactly what it feels like. It feels like improvement. It feels like we're getting more efficient, like experience is being applied to the situation. It doesn't feel like risk is increasing. Now, over time, though, those small shifts, well, they start to accumulate. Not in a way that's obvious day to day, but in a way that slowly changes the overall shape of the system. And because each step along the way made sense, there's no single point where anyone would have stopped and said, this is too far, we've come too far. It's a bit like when you gradually increase your tolerance to something. If you start with something that feels uncomfortable, well, you notice it immediately. But if your exposure increases little by little, we adjust to it. So what once felt like a stretch starts to feel manageable. And it's that eventually that's when it starts to feel normal. I think you can see this quite clearly when you look back on situations, or when people look back on situations with hindsight, they'll say things like, when you look at it now, it seems obvious. But at the time, it didn't feel obvious. At the time, it just felt like a series of reasonable steps. And that's what makes this dynamic so important, because it doesn't rely on people making poor decisions. It emerges from people making sensible decisions repeatedly and in slightly changing conditions. We could think about this another way. So let's think if you walked into a room today and something was significantly out of place, well, you would notice immediately, wouldn't you? It would stand out. But if that same change happened gradually, piece by piece, over a long period of time, you wouldn't experience it in the same way. You'd adapt to each small change as it happened. And over time, the room would look completely different, but it would still feel familiar. That's often what happens inside complex systems. They don't feel dramatically different from one day to the next. But over longer periods of time, the way they operate, well, the way they operate can change quite significantly. And from the outside, everything can still appear stable. In fact, from the outside, it can appear as though things are working well because the system hasn't failed. The system has simply adapted. But adaptation has a way of changing the underlying conditions. The system becomes a little less forgiving and a little more dependent on becomes a little bit more dependent on things continuing to work in a certain way. It's a little closer to the edge than it once was. And the important thing is that no one has consciously decided for that to happen. It's emerged through repetition and familiarity over time, through the quiet process of things that once felt unusual becoming part of everyday practice, which is why it can be so difficult to see, because there's no clear signal that says this is where things changed. There's just a gradual shift in what feels acceptable. And I think that's the part that really matters, because if what feels normal can shift without us noticing, then things appearing to run smoothly doesn't always tell us very much. It might just mean that the system settled into a different place. And by the time that position becomes visible, well, it's often been there for a while. It's just taken time for it to show itself. So when we talk about risk becoming normal, it's not really about people. It's not about people in organizations becoming careless. It's about the system itself changing shape slowly and quietly until what once would have stood out no longer does. And I think holding on to that idea matters, because it reminds us that normal isn't something fixed. It's something that evolves, often without us even realizing it.